Hi, my name is Yvette Jones, and I'm the Community Services Manager with the Rocky Mount Police Department. And on behalf of the City of Rocky Mount Human Relations Commission, the Human Relations Department, the Rocky Mount Police Department, and the Edgecombe and Nash County Sheriff's Offices, I would like to welcome each of you to the Know Your Rights, the Law and You community presentation. We hope the information received from this presentation will serve as a guide for citizens to follow when encountering with law enforcement. Before we begin this wonderful presentation that has been so graciously prepared for you, I'd like to go over some basic steps that will help us get through this evening more productively. During the first half, there will be a PowerPoint presentation that will last about 45 minutes. During the presentation, we ask that all questions be written down on a piece of paper. Again, no questions shall be asked during the presentation. The second half of the presentation has been allotted for questions and answers. However, all questions must be written legibly on the index card that our Nash County Deputy so graciously gave to you as you entered into the room and submitted to the meeting facilitators. All right, we want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to ask questions or at least write the questions down that they may have. The meeting facilitators are Captain Laura Fonstock, and she's walking in the back of the room if she'll raise her hand. And also Ms. Teresa Stokes. Ms. Teresa, she's raising her hands and she's off to my left. A panel has been selected to address questions, and Ms. Stokes and Captain Fonstock will read the questions you submitted and choose the most appropriate panelist, or the most appropriate panelist will volunteer to address that question. No questions will be taken from the floor. Again, all questions must be written legibly. We want to stay away from any personal stories, and if there's an issue that you may have that's kind of personal, that's dealing with maybe a misconduct issue with a particular agency, we ask you to contact that agency after this presentation and talk with someone with that particular agency. Again, we want you to submit your questions on the index card provided to you, and we will try to address them accordingly. We have volunteers that will collect these questions at the end of the presentation. We don't want to waste your time tonight, and this is the best way we feel we can help make this meeting more productive. I will go over these rules again because there may be people that join us that have not heard these rules, and so that we make sure we go through appropriately. As we begin, today's headlines are full of stories detailing encounters between law enforcement officials and citizens. Unfortunately, some of these stories do not have happy endings. While law enforcement officials have standard procedures to follow, citizens do not. As a result, there is often a breakdown in communications between law enforcement officials and citizens. Here is a perfect example.
Watch your head. You okay?
Why can't they just leave those kids alone?
Look at that. Kids half beaten to death.
Yep. Takes real men to beat up a young boy.
My God, did you see that poor child?
Yeah, just like they say. There's too much violence, corruption, and cover-ups. These guys are out of control.
Oh, my God, Miguel! What did you do to him? He's
calm
just
down,
a little
man.
boy.
Yeah, please, sir.
Ave Maria, que te hicieron?
Calm down, sir.
Calm down, sir.
Sir, your son was in an accident.
See, Papa, I fell down the ravine on my bike. The officers saw me and they helped me out. It's okay, they didn't hurt me.
Are you okay with me? Ay, mijito lindo, ¿qué te pasó? Ay, mijito, ¿estás bien? Ay, mi amor.
In a collaborative effort, several agencies and organizations have joined together to present Know Your Rights, the Law and You. Thank you for being here tonight, and I hope you learned something and also enjoy.
Good evening. We live in a land of laws. There are laws that govern almost every facet of our public and oftentimes our private lives. Because of this, no one's freedom can ever rise above the law. This goes for those who make the laws, those who enforce the laws, and those who respect these laws as a kind of prerequisite for simply enjoying the wonderful freedoms that are found in America. Make no mistake about it, the best way to avoid an encounter with the law is to stay out of trouble. If you should have an encounter with those who enforce the law, whether it's for assistance with a broken down vehicle, getting directions, or for what is thought to be an infraction or violation of some kind, you should remember the first word spoken by either the law enforcement official or the citizens involved may very well determine the tone of the encounter and even the eventual outcome. You should remember one of the oldest undergirders of human socialization, and that is respect. Respect promotes the best platform for a meaningful exchange. The best way to get respect is to give respect. Next, we should cooperate. Cooperation doesn't necessarily signal an acceptance of potential charges for something you may not be guilty of, but it does set the tone for a fair and just debate that may not need to take place at that place or time. And finally, be honest. Trickery cannot be associated with smartness. Trickery leads to mistrust. And mistrust at a time when you want to prove your innocence can derail an otherwise civil exchange. So you see, an ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure. Let's be a society of law-abiding citizens. Now, this won't happen if you don't know your rights. Knowing your rights is a powerful force to have on your side when you're faced with adverse situations. Know your rights.
Good evening. My name is Damian Tucker. I'm a partner with the law firm of Hester Moore and Tucker here in Rocky Mount. I want to speak with you briefly about two amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And the first one I want to talk to you about is the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. First of all, freedom of speech basically means that you have the right to communicate one's opinion to anyone who's willing to listen. Obviously, there is free speech and there is speech that is unprotected. Unprotected speech basically are situations that involve libel, slander, hate speech, speech that incites, and or fighting words. And so those kind of speeches or words are not protected, which basically means that you cannot, in any form or fashion, incite anybody to one specific situation is to cause a riot. Secondly, you have the right to assemble peaceably. And that means that you can protest and demonstrate to address any grievances that you may have against your government, your city, or any entity such as that. But your protest must be peaceful. And in most jurisdictions, the right to assemble and protest, you must have a permit, is required to protest and to march. The next amendment is the Fourth Amendment, which gives everybody the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, what is reasonable suspicion that you see as related to stopping and investigating somebody? Reasonable suspicion must be based on more than a hunch. It must be based on a specific articulable facts taken together with the rational inferences from those facts that a person has or is engaged in a crime. You must look at the totality of the circumstances if an officer is involved. And reasonable suspicion may give an officer a reason or probable cause to make an arrest. Reasonable suspicion, an example could be if an officer sees a car driving down the street and is weaving all over the road. That may give an officer a reason to stop that vehicle and investigate further. There are two basic premises to reasonable suspicion. One, it must be based on all circumstances and is based on the process must be raised suspicion of wrongdoing. Now, what is probable cause? Probable cause is a higher standard than reasonable suspicion. And probable cause means that where there are facts or circumstances within the officer's knowledge or trustworthy information that is sufficient to warrant a person of reasonable caution that a crime has been or is being committed, or that property or illegal items are connected with the crime will be found. And an officer must have sufficient facts or sufficient reasons based on known facts to have probable cause, one, to arrest, or both to search. Consent. An officer can ask somebody to consent to a search. And consent basically is an agreement or permission to do or allow something to be done. As it relates to a search, consent must be free and it must be voluntarily given. No coercion or officer intimidation may be used for someone to consent to a search of the person or their property. If an officer does not have probable cause, you can refuse to consent to a search of your person or your property. And always remember that voluntariness of consent is a question of fact. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Donna Doherty, Director of Disciplinary Review and School Safety for Nash Rocky Mount Public Schools.
And I'm retired Captain Robert Baggett, Rocky Mount Police Department. We're going to talk to you about law enforcement encounters.
So if you are stopped on the street by law enforcement, remember to stay calm and do not make any threatening motions or comments.
You don't know why the officer's stopping you or coming up to see you. He may be there to warn you. He may be there to ask if you've witnessed a crime. He may be there to think you're a suspect. But he's trained to respond to movement and action.
If you decide to answer questions, always be factual.
As Damien said, it's your choice. You have the choice if you want to. If you decide to, though, it's best not to lie. Lying causes suspicion. And if the officer stops you or comes up to you and asks you for an ID, that's consensual. If you want to give him your ID, fine. If you don't, fine. Usually it moves a little quicker if you do.
Remember that you always have the right to remain silent.
Again, that's your right. If you'd like to talk to him, you can. If you don't, it's all right. It's better to say, officer, I'd just rather not talk to you. That's okay.
You do not have to consent to a search.
As Damien said, if it's voluntary, you have the choice not to. But remember, if he has reasonable suspicion or he has probable cause to search, you can't refuse that. If you refuse that, you're subject to be arrested for resist, obstruct, and delay. If it's consensual, you can shake your head this way. If it's probable cause, you have to let him search.
If the officer has reasonable suspicion that you are armed and dangerous, then you are subject to be frisked.
A frisk is a pat down of the outer layer of clothing for weapons only. If the officer comes up and says, can I frisk you, then that's consensual, and you can say no. But if he says, I have reasonable suspicion to frisk you, you've got to allow him to do that.
So if you're stopped in your car, move your car to a safe place. Make sure you stop your car in some place that is safe to do so.
You have to stop your car when there's blue lights and sirens. If you think it's an unmarked car, turn on your flashers, slow down, and pull somewhere that's safe. You can also call 911. But speeding up is not the right thing to do.
Stay in the driver's seat and don't make any threatening motions.
Don't reach underneath your seat. Don't reach in your glove compartment. Don't reach above the visor. Remember, officers are trained to see movement. Sit there until he gives you the order to show him your driver's license or whatever.
Make sure you comply with the law enforcement officer's request.
In North Carolina, if you are stopped in a vehicle, in a public vehicle area or on the highway, you have to show them your driver's license and your registration. You have to show them your driver's license and registration.
If the law enforcement officer has probable cause, then your car is subject to be searched.
As Damien told you, probable cause is a higher standard than reasonable suspicion. A lot of people think you need to have a search warrant for a car. There's a law called vehicle exception, which means that if they have probable cause, most of the time they do not need a search warrant to search your car. And you don't have the right to refuse that either.
If you are issued a citation, present your case in court and not alongside of the road.
If you're asked to sign the citation, you don't have to. Signing the citation does not mean you're guilty. Signing the citation means you just received a copy of the citation.
So if a law enforcement official comes to your home, comes to your door, make sure that they really are law enforcement before you open your door.
They'll be in their uniform, or you have the right to ask them for their ID and badge. If the officer doesn't have an ID and badge, who would know who he is?
So you don't have to open the door. You don't have to let them in your home without the proper paperwork.
If somebody answers your door and knocks on your door, you may say, "Officer, can I help you?" And if he asks to come in, again, that's your right. You don't have to let him in the house if you don't want to.
You need to determine what type of warrant the officer has.
There's basically two types of warrant. There's an arrest warrant and there's a search warrant. If the officer has an arrest warrant, somebody who lives there, they have the authority to arrest that person. If he has a search warrant, he's able to come into your house and search for items or persons that he had probable cause. So he may be able to look in different places.
Remember, you always have the right to remain silent.
If you decide to talk to the officer, again, that's your choice.
If there is a warrant for your arrest, contact your local law enforcement agency.
If you had a bad night at the club or your boyfriend or girlfriend gave you some problems and you think they have issued a warrant for you, call the police station, call your lawyer, call a bondsman, and meet us at the magistrate's office. A lot of people do that. That keeps us from coming to your house. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm May Parker. I'm your friendly community leader. And we're going to talk to you about if you're arrested.
Good evening. I'm retired Captain Martin McCoy with the Rocky Mount Police Department.
Keep calm and do not resist.
Certainly, an arrest is in fact a form of seizure, and it is only reasonable to suspect anyone to become excited when they are being arrested. However, the calmer you remain, the quicker the incident will be over, and usually what happens, everyone involved will in fact remain calm, and we can get through this thing expediently.
Never, never attempt to interfere with the arrest of others.
Certainly, an arrest, to see someone being arrested is going to excite anyone that is looking at the arrest take place. However, if you are a person and witnessing the arrest, you should stand back, don't get involved, and let the officers go about their duties and make the arrest.
You should always be told why the reason for your arrest.
Sometimes through the course of the arrest taking place, the officer may or may not have an opportunity to inform the person that's being arrested what he or she is being arrested for. However, they do have the right to know what they are being arrested for, and that will take place at an appropriate time. We hope that that time will happen at the point of arrest.
Be very mindful of what you say.
As I stated earlier, an arrest is in fact a form of seizure. Sometimes we start talking before our heads start thinking. And during those times, we may say some things that will not, in fact, help our case, but hinder our case from receiving a expedient trial or investigation, as well as a just investigation. So be mindful of what you're saying, and at the appropriate time, make sure that you're not saying anything that could put you in further jeopardy.
You will be handcuffed and taken before judicial officials.
It is the policy and procedure of the Rocky Mount Police Department to handcuff individuals that have been arrested. The purpose of the handcuffs is for the officer's safety as well as the safety of the person that has been arrested.
You have the right to make telephone calls.
You do, in fact, have a right to make telephone calls. Sometimes, and I'm sure some of you out in the audience have heard that you have the right to a telephone call. That is not correct. You have the right to make a telephone calls until you have reached someone that can, in fact, provide some form of assistance to you. In the process of making that telephone call, the charges that you may incur are, in fact, yours, not the police department's.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Rachel Mills. I'm a retired educator and currently working with communities and schools of North Carolina.
And I'm Henry King, a police lieutenant, Rocky Mount Police Department.
We're going to talk to you about the use of force. Don't resist arrest. Be courteous, cooperative, and comply.
When dealing with police officers, remember the 3 C's. Be courteous, be cooperative, and be compliant. Most people who come in contact with police use these 3 C's. And this is the way that it should be, because it is unlawful to resist and obstruct an officer while in the performance of his or her duties.
Less lethal force, passive resistance, or aggressive resistance.
Let's talk about passive. When an officer meets resistance, officers are trained to use the level of force justified by the specific threat or resistance they are presented with. For example, if a person pulls away from an officer making an arrest, the officer can choose to apply a compliance hold to that person. Aggressive resistance. When a suspect is actively resisting an officer, the officer can choose to disengage and deploy the taser and or utilize pepper spray to overcome that resistance.
Deadly force. That's either death or great bodily injury.
The vast majority of officers never fire their weapons in the line of duty, but however, some officers have to. When an officer is faced with the threat of death or great bodily injury, or someone they're sworn to protect is faced with the same imminent threat, the officers is justified in using deadly force.
Use of force misconceptions. Deadly force on an unarmed person.
An officer may use deadly force on an unarmed person who is larger, stronger, and or attempting to disarm the officer. For example, in the case where a suspect is battering the police officer to the point that he or she may suffer death or great bodily harm, the officer can use deadly force. Remember, police officers do not have to sustain severe beating in the line of duty.
Certain circumstances determine how deadly force is applied.
When the suspect is fleeing and their escape presents an imminent threat of death and great bodily harm to the community at large, the use of deadly force can be justified.
Officers' training and citizens' perception of their training are different.
Some citizens ask, why didn't the officer shoot the gun out of his hand? These are not realistic options. Handguns are not accurate enough to deliberately attempt such things when lives are on the line.
Complaint or commendation. If you feel you've been mistreated, report the case immediately to the local law enforcement agency supervisor.
Report the case of officer misconduct immediately following your release from police custody. Contact the sheriff department, the police department, a parent, a trusted adult, a school official, your attorney, or the human relations department at your local or city county office.
Provide the law enforcement officer's name, witness information, and factual statement of what occurred.
Always note the officer's name, who you come in contact with, the time of day, the location. Request in a professional manner the officer's name and badge number.
At the conclusion of the investigation, you will receive a letter in reference to your complaint.
After your complaint is filed, you will receive a letter from the chief of police and or sheriff that the investigation staff has concluded the investigations into your allegations. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Corporal Edmonds with the Rocky Mount Police Department. Good evening. My name is Brandon Medina. I'm Chief Deputy with Nash County Sheriff's Office.
At this time, Captain Fonstock and Miss Teresa Austin will start collecting your cards with your questions. If you could just hand them down to the respective end of whatever side of the room that you're sitting on. Captain Fonstock is over here to the right. Thank you very much. Major Medina and I will be discussing some training that our respective law enforcement agencies have undergone and in the process of implementing in our respective agencies regarding fair and impartial policing. For generations now, there's been strained relationships between law enforcement agencies and the citizenry in which we serve. Biased actions can negatively impact relationships between the agency and the community that it serves. Our agency, the Rocky Mount Police Department, strives for police legitimacy, and all of our agencies in our area strives for police legitimacy. That is, the public's acceptance of police decisions, the public's acceptance of cooperation and compliance with our state and local laws. This fair and impartial policing in which we're being trained on helps us get to fundamental goals, that being effective in solving crimes and handling disorder problems, enhancing and promoting trust on the part of the citizens that we serve, and enhancing the legitimacy of the police. With that being said, bias is normal human attributes. All people, even the most well-intentioned people, have biases. Major Medina is going to help us with discussing two types of biases that we identify in this fair and impartial policing training.
In fair and impartial policing, we identify two types of biases. The first one is implicit bias. Implicit bias is a positive or negative mental attitude towards a person, place, or thing on an unconscious level. The second example is explicit bias. This is the same type of positive or negative mental attitudes that someone is consciously aware of and usually don't shy away from expressing that to you. This leads us to four important questions. Whom are we more likely to prejudge?
This is a very good question, Major Medina. This science is identified as ambiguous stimuli. That is, that we are most likely to prejudge the people that we do not know.
What determines characteristics that we assign to them?
Well, these characteristics are determined by stereotypes. Stereotypes that have been ingrained into us since birth. These stereotypes are trained to be based at least in part on facts. I want to take a moment and repeat that so that sinks in. These stereotypes that have been ingrained in us since birth are based at least in part on fact. Let me give you an example. You hear certain stereotypes about different demographics or groups of people being better at sports than others. You hear stereotypes or examples of different groups of people being more gifted in academics, more so than other groups of people. So those are definitely some examples. However, those stereotypes does not justify making policing decisions based on them. Such decisions can be unsafe, they can be unjust, and they can be ineffective.
Do we know when we are prejudging people?
Not always. Most likely, this prejudging occurs outside of a person's conscious awareness. They don't even know when they're doing it.
How is law enforcement learning to overcome these biases?
There's two main ways that's been identified in this fair and impartial policing. The first way is to reduce our implicit biases through positive contact with our citizenry, you. We do this by ways of different programs that have been implemented in our agencies, speaking for the Rocky Mount Police Department, such as the Citizen Police Academy, the Junior Police Academy, in which we deal and interact with youths, Coffee with a Cop program that we use, as well as badges for baseball. The second way is to recognize our biases and make conscious efforts as law enforcement officials to avert acting on those biases when we come into contact with you, the citizenry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And again, I just want to recognize our people that were involved in this, that actually contributed to this. Thank them for taking their time out and being a part of this, because this day wouldn't be possible. The information you receive would not be possible without them. Next, I want to introduce our panelists, and these were people who were picked to actually be a part of the presentation, but are experts in the subject matters that were presented. So if you have a question that may not be about the subject matter that was presented tonight, they may not be the one that can address it, but you can for sure, give a call to the agency that you think may be best to address it later in, on after tonight, and we'll try to see if we can get that question answered. But I'm going to ask them to take their place. I'm going to ask Mr. Damian Tucker. He's one of our panelists from the attorney's office. We have retired Captain Robert Baggett. He's going to be one of our panelists. He's retired from the Rocky Mount Police Department with over 30 years of service and still working with us. We also have retired Captain Mark McCoy, who's also still employed part-time with us and over 30 years of service. We have active Lieutenant Henry King, who is our internal affairs person in charge of our internal affairs office. And we also have Corporal Jared Edmonds. He's going to come back, and he was part, along with Deputy Chief, or how do you say it? Chief Deputy, I said it backwards. Chief Deputy Brandon Medina from Nash County Sheriff Department. He's going to come and also be a part of our panel. So let's give them a hand for braving themselves and coming here to try to address these questions that you have. And I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators. It looks like they're ready to present the questions. And I'm going to turn this microphone over to you, Teresa.
We have several questions tonight about probable cause. So again, I think there's some confusion as to exactly what probable cause is. So if you gentlemen could define what probable cause is again.
Oh, okay. Probable cause, like I said, is more than just a hunch. Basically, an officer has to have specific facts to believe that a crime has been committed or is being committed in order to, one, either arrest someone for that crime and or to search that person or their property or their vehicle or their home. I mean, there are a lot of fact scenarios, and probable cause is based on really the totality of circumstances also. So that probable cause is a determination that is basically fact specific. But like I said, in order for an officer to arrest or search a person or their property, they must have something more than just a belief that something is going on. They have to have some specific facts to show that. Just say, for example, if they walk up to a building at night and they see somebody throwing a brick through the building, that's probable cause to believe that they are trying to break into that building, and they can make an arrest and question that person at that time.
As a follow-up to that question, are officers required to explain their evidence of probable cause?
Not to the person that they're arresting. The only thing I believe that an officer has to do is say that I believe you're breaking into this building based on what I've seen, and what they would have to do is explain those facts that they have witnessed to a magistrate and to have the magistrate issue a warrant for that person's arrest.
How do we ensure that officers are following proper procedures during interactions with citizens and the public without some type of documentation or recording, such as the body cameras?
Well, certainly we have a complaint policy at the Rocky Mount Police Department where we take all complaints. So if you feel that you have been mistreated in any way, or you feel like the officer has done something or didn't provide you some type of proof, you can contact our police department via phone, online, and inquire as to what the incident was, and we'll properly respond back to you.
This is a follow-up to the question just asked. Will police officers in our area be equipped with body cameras?
The Nash County Sheriff's Office right now is looking at different type of funding with regards to grants and then matching grants. So we are looking at some type of body cameras, and right now we're experimenting with different companies to figure out what would be best utilized for us out in the county, and funding. So that's right now is one of our challenges, is the grants and funding.
Another question. How do you deal with someone that does not speak English and is placed under arrest?
Certainly, we have language lines that we have that we can contact our communication center, and the communication center has a 1-800 number that they call that speaks translators that speak all different languages, from Spanish to Mandarin Chinese. So we have a way to explain. Basically, what the process is we call our communications. We tell them the type of language that we need. They call it the number, and then we'll put the person on the phone with the person that's under arrest, and we'll communicate in English to the operator, and then they translate to the individual in that particular language.
The Nash County Sheriff's Office has multiple employees that speak Spanish and 1 or 2 that speak Arabic, and most of us have a supervisor that has access to a cell phone, and we can do translations, which saves time and looking for translating services.
Another concern from citizens, what if the officers refuse to give their name and badge number?
Certainly. If an officer refuses to give his name and badge number, again, you can contact the police department that night or that day, ask for a supervisor, give them a date and time, the location, what occurred with the officer. We have ways to look into our system to find out what officer responded to what call, and we can find out who that officer is, and then we can properly document it from there.
In reporting a case concerning misconduct from an officer, what protects an individual from intimidation from a police officer or other officers? Do I need to read it again?
Currently, we take all different types of complaints, whether online, in person, written communication, and we investigate all complaints on all officers and ensure that the procedures from the responding officers were in accordance with our core values, and everything is investigated by our internal affairs, and usually the outcomes, usually, like we had mentioned earlier, is disseminated to the complaining party as far as the outcome of the investigative process.
What to do, one citizen also wants to know what to do if they have a weapon in their car when stopped.
I'll handle that one. The first thing you want to know, do you have that weapon legal or not? If you have a carrying concealed weapon permit, you know what you've been told to do. You're supposed to tell the officer that you have a permit, and you're supposed to tell him that you have a weapon with you. He may ask to see the weapon. He may ask to see the permit. If you don't have a permit, you need to make sure that weapon is not concealed. Don't lay a newspaper over the top of it, for he might not see it. Leave it on the dash, leave it on the seat, but when he approaches your car, tell him, I have a weapon in this car, officer.
Is there some form of medical consent that departments use that persons can keep in their car when stopped for not wearing a seatbelt? Is there some form of medical form that's used by departments that a person can keep in their car when stopped for not wearing a seatbelt?
No,
I think it give them a waiver, basically, is what they're asking for, a waiver for not wearing a seatbelt.
No, that would have to be DMV. The police department doesn't have such tight form.
This is in reference to information that was shared earlier. So you can be arrested and not told at the time why you're being arrested, but told later?
That is correct. I mean, an officer can arrest you and take you before a judicial official and have you officially charged. I mean, of course, best practices, in my opinion, is for an officer to inform somebody while they're being arrested. And to further go along, there is also a misconception along the lines that, you know, when somebody's arrested, they have to be read their rights at the same time. But, you know, we try to tell clients and people that the only time that rights have to be read is when they're being questioned by law enforcement in a custodial setting.
The officer does have to tell you that he is a police officer and the agencies he's at. He has to say, Captain Baggett, Rocky Mountain Police Department, you're under arrest. He may not know the charges right then, but he has to inform. If he's in his uniform, he doesn't have to tell you that. But if he's in plain clothes, he must identify himself to you.
If I witness an arrest that appears to be causing extreme harm or death to someone, what can I do?
Again, report that case immediately to the Rocky Mountain Police Department or that respective agency, and notify a supervisor or a parent or someone you trust, and so that way we can look into those allegations.
For those of you who may not have heard this information earlier, someone still wants to know, when stopped by an officer, may I continue to drive to a lighted location?
You have to stop when you hear a siren and a blue light. If you just hear a blue light, you don't have to stop. It's a siren, blue light, and siren. Now, if it's an unmarked car and you're not sure, remember I told you to put on your flashers, maybe even cut on your interior lights, slow down. You can also dial 911 and say, there's a car behind me, and the officer should have checked off that he's stopping the vehicle. But do pull to somewhere that's safe under the light. Do not speed up. Do not try to evade. And if there's 3 or 4 police cars around you and a helicopter over you, that's probably the police.
I have several questions around this theme. It's about profiling. And to summarize some of the questions, how can you tell if you're being profiled in a community? In other words, why would someone stop you in a neighborhood, perhaps?
Most agencies respond to calls for service. Either a neighbor has called or a crime has been committed. And during the time of the call, it's called emergency dispatch. The call taker gets information regarding the person of interest, regarding a suspicious person, or a person matching the description of a crime. So officers and deputies respond to the area, trying to identify and locate an individual matching the description. It has been practiced here in local jurisdictions when we encounter someone. The majority of times, the officer or the deputy will advise the person why they're stopping them and verify who they are, where they're coming from, just to figure out what their role is in the area that they're stopped by the officer or the deputy. Normally, they should tell you the reason why they stopped you. Clothing and description and other factors come into play when the officer stops you.
And this goes along with this question. There's some concerns about that if they feel like the arrest is improper, can they video the encounter with law enforcement?
That is correct. The public has a right to record video and then make their case if they decide to pursue advice from an attorney.
If I decide not to speak or answer questions, am I free to simply walk away if the officer has no right to detain me?
I would say the answer to that question is yes. I mean, as we stated earlier, in order for an officer to make an arrest, they have to have probable cause. If they believe that there's, as Captain Baggett stated earlier, they can at certain points frisk for officer safety. If they feel that there's a weapon or something that may be located on the person. But if you're simply walking down the street and an officer comes up to stop you, that's a voluntary encounter. You do not have the right, you do not have to answer those officers' questions at that time. So please, I mean, just remember that and be courteous to the officer, as I always stated. But if it's a voluntary encounter, you do not have to answer that officer's questions at that time.
Another question about searching. Do we have the authority to know what officers are specifically searching for?
If they have a search warrant to search your home, in the search warrant, it'll detail specifically what they're looking for. There's not a such thing as a blanket search warrant. It'll tell what they're for. If they have probable cause to stop you in a car, they may tell you they're looking for drugs, contraband, or weapons. And the same thing on the person. They'll tell you what they're searching for. When they tell you what you're searching for, my friend Joe Hester told me a long time ago, that tells you the scope of the search. So if I say I'm looking for a diamond ring, I can look in your pockets. But if I'm saying I'm looking for a VCR, I can't do that.
Could someone please explain the Miranda rights?
They're all looking at me and they say these every day of the week, I'm sure. Miranda warnings have to be given, like I said, when somebody is in custody, which means that you are basically under arrest and not free to leave. You have to be told that you have the right to remain silent, that anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law, that you have the right to have an attorney present to be with you at questioning, and that you can refuse to answer any questions by law enforcement. As stated, the only time Miranda warnings have to be given is if you're in custody. Just say an officer comes to your home and say, we have suspect that you are involved in an armed robbery. And they take you up to the third floor of their office, put you in a closed room and sit you there. If they sit you in that room and say, you're in custody, you're not free to leave, then at that point in time, they have to read you your rights. A lot of officers, these agencies nowadays will go ahead, if they suspect that you're involved in a crime, will go ahead and read you those rights initially, just so that if they do get a statement from you, that statement can be used in court. Because if you are in custody and those rights are not read to you, then any information, statements that you give to them at that time cannot be used against you in a court of law.
Here's a question about handcuffing again. Even if you're a lady, do you have to be handcuffed behind your back?
Certainly, you have to be handcuffed behind your back. We have a policy that we handcuff everyone behind their back for their safety as well as our safety.
This is in, well, similar to the question you just asked. What determines if a person is cuffed behind or in the front?
Nothing determines that. We handcuff everyone behind their back.
What is considered to an officer threatening motions by someone?
What is considered a threatening motion? On a traffic stop at nighttime when it's dark, again, like Captain Baggett said, cut your dome light on, keep your hands where we can see them. If it's at nighttime and you're making sudden movements, the officers are trained about movements. So what we may perceive as a threatening motion may be just something where you're reaching in your glove compartment to get your registration. So again, we ask that you wait till the officer gives you the instructions to get your driver's license and registration.
Can a person get the police report if they were in an accident, and if they lost it, can they get a new police report?
Certainly, they may come to the police department during business hours and get a copy of a police report or an accident report.
Will law enforcement agencies work with organizations such as NAACP and other local organizations to help reach and raise awareness and create dialogue about the problem of racial profiling nationwide?
This training that our agency has undergone with the fair and impartial policing training pretty much addresses that aspect of that question. It's a very good question. by all means, now that we're getting the information out to the public, addressing this training that we've undergone, we'd like for the public, now that they know, to approach us. And anybody's welcome to approach the police department and ask for any guidance or a synopsis of the training so that they can be aware of it, as well as participate in any of those programs that we mentioned that the police department engages in, such as the Police Academy, the Junior Police Academy, which reaches out to youths from every background and every group of classification of people within our city.
In reference to information released earlier, can officers draw their weapons on unarmed suspects simply because of the size of the individual, even if they are not aggressive?
Again, as I stated, a person can use deadly force on an unarmed person if the person is larger, stronger, and the officer is facing death or great bodily injury. Sometimes officers may draw their weapons depending on the situation or the severity of the crime.
These are some other questions about firearms. Can you have a weapon in a locked compartment in a vehicle, such as a truck or toolbox that's locked?
It may appear to be concealed if it's in a suitcase or a locked box, but it's not accessible to the officer, so the answer to that is yes.
And
unless you're a felon, you can't have one.
And there's just another concern that from the presentation, can we work to ensure that persons being arrested are told at the time of arrest that he or she is being charged with a particular crime? They want to make sure that the crimes are told to them what their charges are. I would say that that answer is yes. And there's one general questions about what has law enforcement learned recently as a final question from the issues that are occurring nationwide, such as at Ferguson and New York City.
Certainly what we'll learn is having programs like this with Know Your Rights to engage into the community, to let the community know that we want a partnership with the community.
And that will conclude the question and answer portion.
I want to thank you for coming out and braving the weather, but we have one more thing before you leave. I want to bring up the City of Rocky Mount Police Chief, Chief James Moore. Let's give him a hand as he comes forward. And I'm going to let him conclude our presentation.
Only because of the lovely ladies behind me, I just want to clarify the Fifth Amendment, or the Miranda rights. And I think, just to make it clear, the Fifth Amendment only attaches when you're under arrest and they're asking you questions about the crime. When you're under arrest and they're asking you questions about the crime. If they're asking you demographic questions while you're under arrest, your name, age, birth date, address, the Fifth Amendment does not apply. You should answer those questions. Under an arrest situation, if you refuse to answer those questions, they will book you at the magistrate's office as a John Doe, and you will not be released to proof of identification. So remember, the Fifth Amendment only applies once you're under arrest and they're asking you questions about the crime. Okay, reasonable suspicion. When an officer has a voluntary encounter, you see somebody walking down the street, he or she gets up and say, hello. The Supreme Court says a law enforcement officer can go and approach any citizen for any reason to have a conversation. That conversation, the officer may obtain reasonable suspicion by your behavior, by how you're touching your body, like you're holding something, maybe holding a weapon, and then reasonable suspicion occurs, which means now I can lawfully detain you while I further my investigation to see if a crime has been committed in this area. That's reasonable suspicion. And the ultimate for Supreme Court says of the land, to make an arrest or to conduct a search, I need probable cause. There's no listing of facts of you need to go through these steps to establish probable cause. As Attorney Tucker stated, it's the totality of the circumstances and the facts presented. And when an officer makes an arrest, by law, by policy, they have to take that individual before a judicial official and they present that case of that arrest to the judicial official, and he or she decides if there's probable cause. And if that's the case, a warrant's issued. It's no different as you as individuals in North Carolina, you can go to the magistrate and pursue a misdemeanor warrant against an individual, which means you're presenting your case that somebody that you know their name and address, they did something. Your neighbor stole something out of your yard, and you go to the magistrate to get a warrant. You're presenting that case to the magistrate. Thank you for attending, and remember, we are one. The police are the public, and the public are the police. And I want to thank everybody for coming out and all of the presenters.